Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. While the focus is always on Pennsylvania, topics like the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Industrial Revolution, the coal and steel industries, and authors like John Updike, David McCullough, and John Grogan have a universal appeal. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This is PA Books, featuring authors of books about Pennsylvania's people, politics, history, and business. This week, Kent Masterson Brown discusses his book, Retreat from Gettysburg.
Kent Brown, author of Retreat from Gettysburg. How long have you been interested in the Civil War?
Oh, gee, Brian, all my life. My first acquaintance with the Civil War was as a little boy. I had a grandmother and aunt and uncle who lived in Martinsburg, West Virginia. And coming from Kentucky, we would take the train to Washington and then the old Baltimore and Ohio from Washington out to Harper's Ferry and to Martinsburg. And I'd get off the train and we'd settle in to the grandmother's little house and wake up the next morning and find myself at Antietam and then at Gettysburg, and it just grew from there. I was totally smitten by sights of battlefields.
Growing up in the South, was the perception of the war different than you have learned how it is in the North?
Oh yeah, vastly. And Kentucky plays an odd role in the war, a substantial one, but it's a schizophrenic kind of role. You got both sides represented in that population. But as a kid in the early 50s, I can remember, for instance, going to the University of Kentucky football games. It was in the Southeastern Conference, and they'd play Mississippi, Louisiana State University, Georgia. And at halftime, the band would gather in the end zone and spell out "Cats" to a kind of souped-up Dixie. And here we are in a state that's considered neutral in the war. Central Kentucky certainly wasn't. It was very Confederate. And evidence of that is that when that band would come out and play that, 38,000, which is all the stadium held at the time, would stand up and cheer until that band left the field. And this is, the 1950s, all the way up until really that practice stopped in the 1960s. But you could tell just the feelings in that state. And a lot of that came from the federal occupation of Kentucky during the war. Even people who were fighting in the Union cause became ardent Democrats after the war because of those kind of issues. And so, yeah, Kentucky very much showed what the war meant to it as late as, my youth.
Do you remember how you were taught about the Civil War in school?
Well, it was a totally balanced thing, from my memory. There was never any attempt to try to lift one over the other. And followed textbooks that most kids would have looked at, and teachers who tried to present it in a very balanced form, except for one. I do remember one wonderful teacher I had in junior high whose name was O'Hare, and I think she thought maybe it might be close to O'Hara. So it was kind of my Gone with the Wind introduction. She was very enamored with the Confederate cause and Confederate personalities, but really it was a harmless thing, and generally speaking, it was all very balanced and fair. It's just that there was this current that you'd feel when you'd go to a ball game or a party or talk or whatever, when the subject came up, you could feel it. And to this day, there's still a lot of that.
Now, your book is called Retreat from Gettysburg. Did you sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write a Gettysburg book, and then start looking around for things that hadn't been done, or was there something about the retreat that intrigued you?
Well, I'll give you a fun tale about me becoming interested in this. Years ago, I remember going to an old relic dealer living outside of Gettysburg, and I acquired then a company-size First National battle flag that had been used during the war. It had written on the tie end of the flag, "Captured at Monterey Gap." And with it was a little card to a Sam Williamson in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, from a Joseph Leslie telling him that, "I'm sending you this flag for our reunion. It was captured from a Georgia soldier named Watson on July 5th. And maybe you guys would enjoy seeing it again." Well, it turns out these two were in the 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry, fought at Monterey Gap, which of course is one of the engagements along the lines of retreat of Lee's.
Where is it?
It's just about, 14 miles west of Gettysburg, on the road between Emmetsburg and Waynesboro as you're crossing the South Mountain Range. And as Richard Ewell's trains of quartermaster and subsistence stores and ambulances were crossing that mountain range through the gap, Judson Kilpatrick's division of Union cavalry struck it and captured some 1,200 prisoners of war, 300 ambulances and wagons, etc. And this was a flag that was seized then. And when I got that thing, I began to ask myself, well, I wonder what Monterey Gap was all about. And that got me to the next stage and the next stage and the next stage. And soon I began thinking, there's probably a story that could be written about this retreat. I've never seen anything like it. And to be very honest, Brian, it was originally, when I even conceived the idea of writing a book, some 20 years ago. It was a book that would be more daring do, cavalry actions, action-packed thing. I never dreamed it would take the permutations it did and come out in the fashion it did. Literally, the research led me to all that.
Well, the popular wisdom about Gettysburg seems to be that after the battle, Lee headed south and that was it.
Yeah.
But your book suggests that there was a lot of fighting along the way.
There was a tremendous amount of fighting along the way. Obviously, George Meade was terribly interested in finding out information about where his enemy was going. He knew he was breaking off combat on July 4. It started to rain, poured rain. He knew he was breaking off combat, and he knew that all these trains were moving west. The problem George Meade faced, though, was that he didn't know whether they were going west back to the mountains to fortify them, which many of his chief lieutenants believed that's what Lee was doing, or whether he was actually going to cross the South Mountain Range and head back across the Potomac River, which was 45 miles to his rear. And that presented a major dilemma to George Meade. So he uses all of his mobile units, cavalry units, to try to chase these trains and then try to send information back so he could get some idea as to where this enemy is going. That takes time. The problem George Meade faces is that his army is probably in worse shape than Lee's. And it's in bad shape because he has had to rely upon a supply line from Baltimore that terminates at Westminster. And the reason he couldn't get a supply line any closer was that Lee had destroyed all the bridges on all the railroads between Hanover Junction and Harrisburg and between Hanover Junction and Gettysburg. And all through the battle, George Meade had railroad engineers trying to reconnect, particularly the Hanover Junction and Gettysburg route, so you could get a train into Gettysburg. But when the battle evolved on July 1 and Meade had to come out of this preconceived Pipe Creek defense line, he rushed all of his commands forward to Gettysburg, some 30 miles, some 15 miles, some 20 miles ahead, and ordered all of their subsistence and quartermaster trains back to Westminster, which was the railhead. And so this battle was fought with no subsistence stores no quartermaster stores. Most of his men were ravenously hungry, short of ammunition. His horses and mules were in really desperate shape. And he'd wind up losing 15,000 of them between Gettysburg and Frederick trying to chase Lee. So, I mean, you can see how fragile armies are when you don't keep them supplied regularly and adequately. And that's really one of the themes in this book.
Well, one of the things you talk about is a lot of the foraging that Lee's people would do. They'd go out in the countryside and gather things. Did the Northern Army do the same thing?
Oh, of course they did. They did it up here.
In their own
Absolutely.
territory.
Where Meade was short of subsistence stores, they would seize them. Now the government, those claims were paid better. In fact, they were paid for the most part if you could provide evidence that Meade actually took them. But they were so short that the Army of the Potomac was impressing mostly fodder for animals. That was the critical thing. A man can go about 10 days without having an adequate meal, but a horse or a mule cannot, and they'll collapse. Now, on the other hand, Lee, from what the research began to show me, his whole motive for getting into Pennsylvania was to forage his army. They were totally without. They were on the brink of collapse in Virginia, so much so that he had to scatter all of his field artillery units just to try to find grazing lands for the horses and the mules. Lee has 40,000 horses and mules in this army, 75,000 combatants, 20,000 plus non-combatants. And you think a horse or a mule has to have at least 3 pounds of oats a day. You should feed him 10. Lee has to wake up every morning knowing that he has about a 3 or 4 day window of opportunity to get a decent amount of fodder in each of those 40,000 horses and mules. It's just a staggering thing to think about. And this is what drives an army. And the fact that he goes into Pennsylvania foraging, I mean, was a classic. It's recognized by every military theorist of the age that is a legitimate reason for invading enemy country.
He wasn't going to seize Harrisburg?
No, he had no intention. And the reason that's clear is that Lee keeps that army always with these macadamized roads leading to the Valley Turnpike, which is also macadamized, to his rear throughout the entire time. He relies upon that line of supply all the way to Staunton, Virginia, and then by rail to Richmond for his communications with his government, to receive convalescents back to the Army who are constantly moving up and down the Shenandoah Valley to his rear. He's relying upon that line for reserve ordnance stores that he has ordered. They don't arrive until the 5th of July, almost literally in the nick of time for him to defeat a cavalry foray against his trains at Williamsport. But all of those things keep the Army alive. All of these stores, those that Lee is not actually consuming, his men aren't consuming while in Pennsylvania, are being moved up and down the Shenandoah Valley and the Cumberland Valley to Winchester, his supply base in the valley. And he's going to collect 35,000 head of cattle down there by the time he gets across the Potomac, 30,000 head of sheep, 57 miles of trains. This guy isn't interested in taking Harrisburg.
You said there was nothing, he was out of supplies in Virginia. So
totally.
Why is it on his home ground he couldn't supply his army?
They've been fighting in central Virginia for 2 years. And one has to just begin, you see literally the size of what Lee confiscates and impresses in Pennsylvania. In the 2 weeks, 1 corps is there. And then the remaining 2 corps are there for a lesser period of time. But they managed to seize trains this big, 57 miles of them, 35,000 head of cattle. Actually, it was almost 50,000. Some of these were left along the roadside, some drowned trying to cross the Potomac River as they were being herded across. But he gets clear into Virginia, 35,000 head of cattle, 30,000 head of sheep, thousands of hogs. Now, if these 2 armies had campaigned in that region for 2 years, You can just imagine. There's nothing left. And that's the problem. And some of the photography we have of the area in central Virginia illustrates a barren wasteland, just a wasteland. And every officer, every soldier who wrote a letter to his sweetheart or an officer to his War Department in Lee's army commented on how difficult subsistence is now becoming, and how this army, can't continue without finding subsistence. And Lee has been on a mission to try to find it all through the spring, and even detaching elements of his army to Suffolk to try to Longstreet. So that's why he's not at Chancellorsville. He's trying to forage for food.
You mentioned macadamized roads, and I saw that referred to a couple times in your book. What kind of shape were they? I thought all roads were dirt roads then.
No. A lot of these roads that all the roads Lee's relying upon are macadamized, meaning crushed rock. Give you an example of what one looked like. The Valley Turnpike was macadamized, ran from the Potomac River to Stanton. It's crushed rock, 18 feet wide. Usually had stone fences. They'd encourage stone fences on either side because then herdsmen could herd sheep and cattle and whatever up and down the valley without them wandering off the road. These roads were maintained under a legislative system that allowed gatekeepers who agreed to perform the service to maintain 5-mile stretches of the road, and they would collect tolls to do that. And same system in every state in the Union, frankly, at the time. So every 5 miles along the Valley Turnpike, you'd come to a toll house and a gate. And the same is true of the Cumberland Valley Turnpike from the Potomac all the way to Harrisburg. And the Cashtown Road from Chambersburg to Gettysburg was macadamized. The road from Gettysburg to Fairfield over Monterey was not, except when you reach the summit of Monterey. Then the turnpike from Emmetsburg to Waynesboro, then down to Leitersburg and Hagerstown, and finally to Williamsport was macadamized. So he has these sorts of roads in his rear which are impervious to rains, rough to ride over if you're in a spring wagon, but it's better than knee-deep in mud, which some of these trains get mixed up in who are trying to take alternate routes.
You have a story in here, and again, the popular wisdom is sort of that Lee told his people not to steal from the locals. And you have a scene in here where there were 30 or 40 soldiers seizing every guinea, fowl, turkey, and chicken in one Pennsylvania farmyard. Lee happened to ride by as a frightened and angry woman who lived in a nearby farmhouse ran outside, yelling for him to stop them. Lee merely touched the brim of his hat and said, "Good morning, madam." He rode on down the road to the complete amusement of his men. So where do you find a story like that?
That was in the letters of two brothers who were in the 3rd South Carolina Infantry. Tally Simpson was his name. It's a marvelous picture of Lee. And a picture of him that we, I think, have ignored for years. Lee is a very different man in my research than, and I come from a real kind of Lee tradition. I mean, I went to Washington and Lee University, and I was there yesterday, and his tomb is there, and I mean, he's worshipped there, and he has been by me for years, always, and to this day. Except you have this picture of Lee, of this lost cause Lee, of laying hands off, of making sure no one disturbs private property, this old lost cause tradition. But the truth of the matter is that Lee is a hard-nosed combat soldier. And if his army was hungry, he would feed it. Now that's why he's up there. And for these soldiers, he would obviously was letting them seize property, as long as they didn't hurt individuals. And there's very few recorded incidents of that. There are few, but very, very few. He still would allow them to purchase, acquire, however they did it, foods for themselves at the time, so as to save his own stores that he is seizing through quartermaster services and subsistence services, so they could get back to Virginia and feed that army for the ensuing campaigns, but let the soldiers eat what they can find. That is clearly what's going on, and that's only one story. But that shows Lee himself looking at this, seeing they're taking guinea fowls and chickens, and the civilian is totally distraught over this whole thing, and he just touches the brim of his hat and goes, "Good morning, ma'am." And every one of his soldiers are just laughing out loud, thinking this is just great stuff. But it shows you a different kind of Lee now than we always have been led to think about with that old General Order number 72, where he said, you know, don't disturb private property.
Why is Lee still revered to this day?
Well, he is almost a larger-than-life figure. I think it's his ability to stand up, to do what he did in the face of literally overwhelming odds. Odds he recognized himself. I found a letter once he had written to General William Mahone, or a reference in a letter of General William Mahone's to a conference he had with Lee. This letter was 72 pages long, and he wrote it in a hotel room, Mahone did, after the war in Washington. And he talked about a meeting he had with Lee. This was during the retreat from Richmond to Appomattox. And he said, you know, I went into Lee's tent and we conversed briefly. And he turned to me and he says, you know, General, I never thought we could win this war militarily. And I mean, here's a man who, of course, this is in the death throes of the Army. But so much of his operations, this campaign included, illustrate a man who wants desperately to see this war over with, recognizing they cannot continue in the field, matching what the Union's able to put into the field against them, trying to find a way to bring it to a conclusion, trying to keep his army alive at the same time, so as to do that. All these things are tremendous odds. It's the same reason we revere Washington. Douglas Freeman, though, would say that what he loved about George Washington, he saw a sunrise with him, but with Lee, he saw a sunset. Same sort of odds, same sort of thing, but one was a victory and one was a defeat.
Who is Clausewitz?
He's a Prussian officer from the Napoleonic Wars who wrote a masterful treatise on mostly military strategy and as opposed to tactics. And I like to use him because, one, the translation we have now from the German to the English was done at Princeton, and it's a magnificent translation. It's called On War, and it is his compiled theories of how war is conducted. Clausewitz doesn't invent these theories. These theories are ancient, and he simply kind of catalogs them, saying here's what the experiences of armies are like in this situation. And he, like Jomini, the French theorist, who wrote a book titled War, both of them discuss retreats after lost battles. Except Clausewitz, the translation there is the clearest, easiest to understand for anybody. And I like to use him. And what's fascinating about it is you read him and then you watch what Lee does. And it's like Lee had memorized it, even though he probably never read it, but knew the theories.
It wasn't studied at West Point?
No, not Clausewitz. Jomini was well known in the old Army, and there were other theorists. These theories were discussed. It's just the way in which Clausewitz articulated them is so good for a reader.
What is it that Clausewitz said about retreating that Lee appeared to have used?
Well, there are a whole lot of things one might consider minor, like how you arrange your army. You never use divergent routes. If you're going to use parallel routes for the convenience of the march, that's okay. But at least these seem minor. They're very big in the big picture. The fact that a retreating army should move slowly, deliberately, And you would think it would be just the opposite. But you also think, now we're talking about a retreat after a lost battle. There's a decline in morale. Always accompanies an army that's been defeated. And his idea was, as is Jomini's, that if you move fast, you start losing men by the army begins to disintegrate. And it's because of the mindset. If you move deliberately, the army is always collected, and you actually invite the enemy to attack you. And so a good retreat, a retreat that has possibilities of turning defeat into victory, is one that invites small-scale engagements all along the retreat route, that it uses terrain, geographical features that can aid in the retreating army seizing initiative. But as Clausewitz says, the final result of this kind of a retreat is the commanding officer of the army must regain for his army the equilibrium between that army and the enemy. The regain, as the translators put it, the balance of power between the two. And that is precisely what happens in this retreat. And that's why, when I look at Gettysburg and I say, is this really a turning point? It was certainly a massive tactical defeat for Lee. But is it a turning point in this big war going on? And that's where you almost have to come to the conclusion it was not, because he regains the equilibrium between himself and his enemy by getting across the Potomac, all that he did, plus the army being intact.
When Lee decided it's time to retreat, have to get out of here,
Mm-hmm.
how was it communicated to his troops to do it in a methodical way and not just hit the road?
Well, one thing for sure, Lee met in A.P. Hill's tent, literally behind the center of his lines. They met for hours. James Longstreet, Richard Ewell, his other two corps commanders came in. Lee orally instructed them. Now, he issued written orders telling the order of retreat, who should follow whom, who should be the rear guard, how the advance and the rear are to look, with the being augmented with mounted troops, where the field artillery should move in relationship to the infantry, all of this, who's controlling what. And we've got those orders in the official records. But then there are countless other things that occur that result from oral commands. And I'll tell you what, Lee comes over to me as a man who gives a lot of oral commands, has to. But he's one who makes things, at least on this retreat, crystal clear. The officer who receives those orders knows he's either to comply with them to the letter, or he's going to hear from this commander. Lee is almost a modern warrior. He can micromanage these officers. There's evidence of it, tremendous evidence of him just micromanaging every move they make. Lee never seems to sleep. He's in the saddle constantly, overseeing the movements of this army. So you've got a command staff of the army, the commander and his staff, who are overseeing it. You've got lieutenants, corps commanders, division commanders who are admonished exactly what this commander expects. And this army responds. It does exactly what this man demands they do. And you almost see this picture of this army being moved by the force of will of this commander. And again, a different Lee than the tradition I've always known of this laid back, doesn't get too involved in everybody's business, gives these commands and lets his lieutenants fill in the blanks, so to speak. You hear this a lot, and boy, it's not so. This man's on top of everything this army does.
Did he know exactly where his army was headed when they left Gettysburg?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. He tells them in writing where he's going. We're going to cross at Falling Waters. He orders to cross the Potomac. We'll cross at Williamsport, where we cross to get in here.
This is Williamsport,
Maryland. right on the C&O Canal. And they all know exactly where this army is moving. Even those commanding the huge trains that leave in advance of the army. He gives them explicit instructions as to where to take these things, how to get across the Potomac, where they're going to rendezvous with the rest of the army.
If Lee's purpose being in the North was to get supplies, why did he fight at all?
Well, of course, that's the huge question that everybody has always asked. However, the foraging issue, I think, helps explain why a battle evolved more than I think we've seen before. And that is, it's not A.P. Hill moving up from Cashtown just to smell out a fight. A.P. Hill moves an entire division forward to Gettysburg for purposes of protecting foraging trains. They're foraging east of the mountains. And that's, again, what they're there for. And Harry Heath's division is outside of Gettysburg on July 1, accompanying trains that are foraging on the roads alongside that division of infantry. And that's what causes the first clash. And from there, it's really a matter of subordinate commanders thinking they can easily brush this thing aside, and the battle then building up over the course of the morning, Meade rushing, having forces way out in advance of his main lines, and then rushing elements of his army forward as the day progresses. And then Lee doing the same thing. Each commander, one trying to protect the army that's being attacked, and Lee actually believing, and his subordinates believing, that they can score a victory out here. And any victory on Northern soil, is going to be important to a man like Lee, who, again, doesn't necessarily believe that this war is going to be won militarily, but if a major victory on Northern soil could turn the balance of the war effort. Reduce it in the North and increase it in the South. So you've got all these kind of things playing in this. And when Lee actually comes on the battlefield on the afternoon of July 1, he actually believes he can score a major hit, and does. And then the question is, when the Union Army falls back onto the heights and is now being reinforced over the course of the night, what does Lee do now? He has not gobbled them up. He has beaten them badly. But now what do you do? And then comes the big question, once again, why do you attack on July 2nd? And
right, when he saw the Union on high ground, couldn't they have just said, well, we got our supplies, let's hit the road?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, he gives an excuse in his after-action report. He says that my trains are so long, so massive, that I feared actually moving them out on July 2nd and July 3rd. Yet he ultimately had to. It's a hard thing to figure, really, other than Lee believes as James Longstreet wrote, the hunt was up. I think I can hit a lick, and tries. This is the type of man he is, the type of combat officer he is, and he came up short.
You say in the book that his train was something like 17 miles long?
No, they're actually multiple trains. They all together total 57 miles. I mean, this just shows how huge the effort was. The famous train that we hear about is John Imboden's, the one General John Imboden protected. That's the one that goes out the Cashtown Road. It consists of Longstreet's and A.P. Hill's corps trains and division trains, and Jeb Stuart's division trains, and these brigade trains as well. They were quartermaster, subsistence, ordnance, and ambulance trains, all in order by division. And that was 17 miles long, that train. Now remember, they had not been foraging as long as Dick Ewell. Dick Ewell had been up there with his corps for 2 weeks ahead of these people. On the Fairfield Road is Dick Ewell's trains, and he has a reserve train that he was collecting stores for the Army itself. That was parked 8 miles in Lee's rear. That thing was 20 miles long. And once that train cleared Fairfield on the road toward Monterey, then each of Ewell's division trains follow it. And each one of those are 7 miles long. So you've got 40 miles of trains on the Fairfield Road, and you can actually time them from diarists, showing how long it took to get one train past a given point. When the nose of that train reaches Hagerstown, the rear of it is still coming out of Gettysburg. Wow. Just enormous amount of stores.
Well, by a train, is it
wagon train?
One? Do they go single file?
Single file. Single file.
How fast did they move?
Well, for instance, the Imboden's train was timed by people. They claimed it would take 36 hours to pass any given point. There's a good example. That's 17 miles. So you can see how long a 40-mile-long train would take.
Wouldn't that make them enormously vulnerable to attack?
Of course.
And you can't defend a 40-mile-long
Hence,
train.
this is what Lee said in his after-action report. It was his great fear was those trains. They're so big. And that was the first glimpse I got when I was doing this research of, how big are these things? I mean, I had no idea. And but then I started going after one diary after another, one report after another, and you could begin to start time them. And then there were some people who actually witnessed them to give you an idea of their length. And there were at least 4 different diarists who could record Ewell's trains being 40 miles long. I mean, and how long they would take to pass each point. The reserve train took, it started somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 o'clock in the morning and didn't clear Fairfield until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So there's an example of just how big that thing was.
Well, how long did it take Meade to figure out that Lee was not fortifying the mountains, and did he take after him then?
Oh, absolutely he did. Now he has cavalry units moving on the flanks, trying to reach the flanks of those trains. Some do, some actually attack them, like at Monterey. Then they're attacked again at Hagerstown on the 6th of July and Williamsport, but all of those attacks are repulsed. Meade actually pushes one of his corps all the way through Fairfield behind Lee's retreating army, not to provoke a general engagement back there, but for John Sedgwick to tell George Meade what Lee's doing. Is he fortifying those mountains? And on the evening of the 5th of July, John Sedgwick had to tell his commander, it appears as though they're fortifying the mountains. Meade countermands all the orders of the army to move toward Frederick. He waits until the next morning. The next morning is dense fog. This is the 6th of July. And he does not find out until a cavalry unit moves up the Maria Furnace Road toward Monterey sometime around mid-afternoon of July 6, and finds that where they had seen all the campfires, even in the driving rain, they would be lighted, where they had seen those the night before, the army had left. So riders go back out to George Meade and they say he is now moving into the Cumberland Valley. Meade reissues the orders he had countermanded 30 hours before, and the army now moves toward Frederick with the idea of moving through the next available pass, which is Turner's Pass and Fox's Gap and Crampton's Gap, to confront Lee outside of Williamsport. And believe me, Meade's army moves with just enormous speed. But these men still haven't been fed. None of them have been fed. This is now the 6th of July. And this is where he's going to start seeing horses and mules breaking down. He's going to lose 15,000 of them trying to get there. And some of his field artillery can't even be pulled across the mountains.
He still didn't have his supplies?
No, see, they're all still in Westminster, and he couldn't move that base. His fear was, if I move the base to Gettysburg thinking Lee's fortifying the mountains, okay, I might get my army fed. But what if I'm wrong and Lee is actually moving down? It's going to take now yet another week, because they're going to have to ship all the material back, move them across Baltimore to the B&O Railroad, and then ship them to Frederick. And he could not afford it. He couldn't afford to lose that kind of time, or his army would go down.
How was Lee able to forage and have so So abundant supplies and...
So he was carrying it with him. He was carrying his supplies with him that he had the intention of getting in Pennsylvania. That was his whole mission. That wasn't George Meade's mission. George Meade's mission was to protect the capital, do all those kind of good things. But as a defensive role, Lee was out there gobbling up everything he could find. And his men were foraging, as you read, on their own. So here's an army that is not necessarily better fed than George Meade's, but it has fodder and it has subsistence stores with it. And even the newspaper men who were following George Meade's army complained that here we are in our own country, yet Lee is the one falling back on his own base. We are not. We don't have one. See, it's being shifted.
Were there friendly local residents around Gettysburg friendly to the South who helped him out?
You mean Lee?
Lee, yeah.
No, I mean, clearly not. He had to confiscate what he got, hand him, and it was a regular, he issued orders on how to do this to each quartermaster and to each subsistence officer. Go up to a farm, say this is what you want, pay them the market price.
In Confederate money?
In Confederate scrip. I mean, and we all snicker at that, but then, I mean, if the Confederate government ultimately won this thing or was ultimately recognized, it'd be worth something. But it was all they had. And so they were paid, unless they put up a resistance, and then it was seized. Or they tried to hide it, and Lee said, take it. And, but what's just phenomenal is that, back into the mid-90s, while I was working on the research on this thing, I got a telephone call from the curator at the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond, and he says, Kent, you might have something here of interest to you. And I said, what is it? And he said, they're just some quartermaster records. And he says, they've never been opened. And that really, keyed my interest, so I went over there. And tied up in red strings, never been untied since 1896 when they were given to the museum when it was established. We opened them up, and here are these enormous grids with the article that Lee wants across the top. Down this left-hand side were the property owners they were taken from. On the right-hand side was the amount of money paid, and in all these boxes were the numbers of each article they got from each property owner. And these were all from James Longstreet's Corps, some from A.P. Hill's, the only ones known to exist. But they show a systematic effort of stating exactly what's needed in this army to keep it going, and showing how much each quartermaster of each regiment, of each brigade, of each division, of the corps is getting. So you could chronicle just how the effort that's going on either side of this army. Even while the battle's raging, quartermasters are out there seizing property. It's amazing.
How much time did you spend in dusty old libraries with documents like that?
I love dusty old libraries. Tons, even on family trips. My wife's a great sport about all this. She loves history too. We would go into repositories and while we're on a trip, and when I'm on a law trip, I find a repository and go over to it, spend some time, and I mean, it was just countless hours. And some of them were fruitful, some of them not. And then so many people got to know what I was after that I would get calls periodically, and this was one of them. And as I told John Koski, who is the curator at the museum, as I've told him, and I've said in the acknowledgments of the book, it was just totally decisive, that find. And never been, quartermaster records seem boring. Who wants to look at how many shoes an army gets? But when you look at it in context of a campaign like this, it becomes a very powerful instrument to examine.
Speaking of research for this book, you thank the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. What did you glean from the Baseball Hall of Fame about this?
Interesting. What they had there was a painting of Abner Doubleday. But Abner Doubleday is a very young officer, and the painting was done of Doubleday up at the site of a Union battery overlooking the Potomac River at Williamsport. And I actually thought of using the illustration in the book. It's a glorious little painting. But I never, we hit the number I felt and the press felt we could use, and this one just didn't make the cut. But it was a painting showing Union troops moving from Williamsport across the Potomac, wading the Potomac at the ford to go into then Virginia, now West Virginia. And it's one of the greatest illustrations of that ford I have ever seen. And done in 1861, and it shows 1861 troops. But here is clearly the C&O Canal, the pivot bridge over the C&O Canal, down to the ford. You can see all the scenes. You can see Lemon's Ferry and the house Maidstone on the Potomac across where the ferry boat operator lived, Robert Lemon. And all these sites were critical to Lee's retreat because he uses that same ferry, the flats on that ferry where this army is crossing. And by looking at this painting, you can see exactly where the ford was. And so it was a very interesting, very, very interesting illustration. And of course, Doubleday, of course, the founder of baseball, they say.
Theoretically, yes. Now, you have a lot of pictures in the book, and a few of them are listed as never before published.
Never before published.
You have a personal collection of Civil War pictures?
No, what I did over the years, I collected these illustrations. Some of them are from private collections. Some I just purchased, the positive prints. One of them that I acquired was years ago. It was an old print made about 1880 of the site of Falling Waters. Now that's a never before seen image of William Tipton showing the site where the pontoon bridge was that most of Lee's army crossed. It's never been seen before. It's a magnificent picture done in the winter so you can see all the dwellings on the West Virginia shore. There's an illustration of George Emack, whose little cavalry company, two companies actually, defended all of Kilpatrick's division up at Monterey, and General William Tidwell in Virginia had done some work on Emack, the Confederate Secret Service, and Emack played a minor role in that, and he happened to have that picture, and I called him up and actually trying to get information from him, and he said, well, I have a portrait of George Emack. It's never been seen before. And then pictures of the bottomland at Williamsport where, 6,000 of Lee's wagons were parked along that bottomland. That's never been seen before as it would have looked right after the war. There's some fascinating images there, I think.
Can you explain how a pontoon bridge works?
Yes. I'll explain how the pontoon bridge at Falling Waters worked. There were 26 pontoons. These are like huge boats, like a big gondola, and they'd float. And these were, they traveled on wagons that were built to hold them. So you literally 26 wagons hauling each one a pontoon. And then there were wagons that carried the trestle work between the pontoons that actually held the pontoons together and formed the bridge. And when Lee invaded Pennsylvania, he put a pontoon bridge that he had just gotten into the Army. He had ordered it in April, and the engineer department had just sent it to him. And there was an engineer team that would work to assemble this and protect it. And they would put one pontoon in the water after another, attach those pontoons with trestle work, and then as the minute they got all 26 of them in the river, they would then anchor them with huge boxes literally filled with rocks on chains or ropes, and that would keep the bridge from moving with the current. And then you would lay across the top the boarding, and there would be your pontoon bridge. And you could literally disassemble this and take elements of it and keep it on the shore so that you couldn't be attacked, which is what they did. And they were ultimately attacked on the the night of wee hours of July 4, and that bridge was partly burned by Union cavalry. So when Lee gets down to the Potomac, it's been raining for 10 days. The Potomac is now at 13 feet deep, where they forded it to get into Maryland and Pennsylvania. It's now swollen. No pontoon bridge, and his army is seemingly trapped north of the Potomac. It's a dramatic moment. And Lee actually takes the remnants of that pontoon bridge, has his engineers in 62 hours reconstruct 26 pontoons, all the trestle work from just dismantling barns and buildings, and reconnects an 800-foot span across the Potomac River. It's the most amazing engineering feat I can imagine.
Before we run out of time, can I ask you a little bit about yourself?
Sure.
You mentioned you're an attorney, you do lawyering work. What kind of attorney are you?
Most of the work I do is civil rights work, constitutional work. Most of the clientele I've had over the years are healthcare providers, and not all, but some, a good portion. And as the best way to explain it is that I sue governments over things they do that some individuals feel they shouldn't do. And I love constitutional law. It's part of my love of history, frankly.
Where'd you go to law school?
Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia.
And undergraduate school?
Center College in Kentucky. Little school of 750 kids who in 1921, now, their football team defeated Harvard and Cambridge 6-0 to become the national football champ. And they'll never let you forget it.
And you are also editor of something called The Civil War in Kentucky.
I was the editor of a book called The Civil War in Kentucky, yes.
Well, what can you tell us about, what's an interesting fact about the Civil War in Kentucky that we might not know about?
It contributed some 80,000 troops to the Union cause, some 30+ thousand to the Confederate cause that we can account for. That although it declared itself neutral in May 1861, by September its legislature was entirely in the hands of pro-Union forces. Actually made it a felony to be a Confederate officer in Kentucky. Elected an entire delegation to Congress that was pro-Union in 1861. It was a Union state. Even though central Kentucky and far western Kentucky had tremendous Confederate support. John Hunt Morgan came from there. His men came from there. John Breckinridge, General Preston, tremendous number of Albert Sidney Johnston, who died at Shiloh as a Kentuckian. It contributed tremendous personalities to the war. Although from the winter of 1862 until the end of the war, when Confederates left the state because of Grant's operations up and down the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers and the Mississippi, Kentucky was entirely in Union hands during the war, save for a brief invasion in 1862 and other incursions, raids in and out of Kentucky. But Kentucky still to this day is a kind of schizophrenic about all this. It's a fun place.
When Lee was heading south, did he have Northern prisoners of war with him?
Had 4,000 of them, yes, which adds to his difficulty.
Wouldn't it have been just as easy to let him go so they didn't have to haul them
Well,
along?
he wanted to parole them. He actually sent messages across to George Meade offering the cartel to parole. You parole mine, I'll parole yours. And the War Department, though, had issued strict orders on the eve of this campaign. They wouldn't accept any more paroles. So with it in mind that Lee could never get his back, he made the determination to shut off any attempts to parole these guys, and we'll take them with us. And of course, that forms one of the more interesting sub-episodes of this whole story, is following those poor devils all the way down to Stanton, Virginia on foot, 200 miles, and then on trains to Richmond to prisons. And some of that entourage were civilians from the Gettysburg area and Valley area, Cumberland Valley area, who had gotten in either behind Confederate lines and tried to get out and were seized, or had done something that Lee's provost marshal felt they shouldn't have done, and they herded him south of the rest of them. So that's an interesting story all itself.
How many of Lee's wounded did he take with him, and how many did he leave
We
back
can
in
account for
Gettysburg?
them. The records at Stanton General Hospital in the Shenandoah Valley showed nearly 9,000 getting out of Gettysburg, 200 miles to Stanton, Virginia. Of that nearly 9,000, I can say pretty safely that if they got that far, pretty nearly 90% of them would survive. Many to come back into the ranks, which is another example of why Lee keeps this line of supply in his rear. He has a means to evacuate his sick and wounded, and he had a lot of sick too. There are nearly 5,000 just sick soldiers. If he can have a means to evacuate them, to get them to recover, he can get them back. And his admonition was to get them better and then send them back into the Army. And so only a sophisticated medical evacuation system could do it, and he had one in his rear. It had been in place since 1861.
Was the Union Army in hot pursuit, and when they got to the Potomac and realized Lee was across, did they kind of say, oh, well, he got away?
Well, they were in hot pursuit. And actually, on the eve of Lee beginning the movement across the Potomac, were confronting him 2 miles away, had set up lines 2 miles away. The problem with it is that they couldn't have assaulted, although Meade actually called a council of war to determine whether or not his lieutenants wanted to. It's because the rains made the area between Lee's defense lines, which were 50 feet higher than where Meade's army was. You'd have to assault up a long ridge that was broken up with heavy field artillery up there. But you'd also have to assault across land that was literally underwater. Marsh Run runs between Lee's defense lines and George Meade's, and the assault would have had to take these poor devils waist and shoulder deep through mud and water to get there. So it's just not feasible. It just was not feasible. Meade gets there in time, but there's little he can do.
You say in the book that the newspapers in Richmond blamed Lee for the loss at Gettysburg.
There was a lot of blame of Lee for this. They felt some of his decisions at Gettysburg were not comprehensible, just like we talked about before. These are contemporaries. However, in the end, they refer to him, these tremendous critics, keep referring to him as our great captain. So they criticize him for what he did there tactically. But then they also say, you know, it appears as though he has more beef on the hoof now than we've ever seen in this army. So they can see the benefits of the invasion that Lee gets across, but they somewhat castigate him for some decision making. Yet, remember, not one of those reporters was allowed anywhere near that army. During the Gettysburg, the battles, Lee would never have him near headquarters. He would never share after-action reports with him. These guys were getting their information from wounded who were being taken across the Potomac River. One newspaper reporter said, I know as much about this army. This is a Richmond paper. I know as much about this army as if it were in the middle of Africa. I mean, that just shows you what a blackout there always was around Lee's headquarters. He would not tolerate anyone near him.
It took you how long to write this book?
Well, it took nearly 20 years of research and writing. And of course, I'm not a full-time professional historian. I have to do this in the midst of earning a living, doing other things. But 20 years, and it took about 4.5 years to actually compose it.
Do you have another Civil War book in you?
I have 3 going now. One a reminiscence of one of Morgan's men from Kentucky. I'm doing a small work on the Lincolns in Kentucky. The National Park Service asked me to do a title exam on one of the Lincoln boyhood home in Knob Creek. And it's a story of all the legal difficulties of Abraham's father and how he lost every piece of land he ever had in Kentucky. It's an interesting little tome. And then I'm doing another major work on the Antietam campaign, the first invasion of Maryland.
Well, we'll have to keep an eye out for those. This is the book we've been talking about, Retreat from Gettysburg. Kent Brown, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. We'd like to hear from you. Our email address is pabooks@pcntv.com. Like us on Facebook to learn more about PA Books.